On the evening of November 8, 1979, James Mitchell received a phone call that would unravel 15 years of friendship. The call came at 9:47 p.m., just as he was finishing the dishes in his Arlington apartment, and the voice on the other end belonged to someone he had never met, but who claimed to know everything about the man James considered his closest friend. The caller identified himself as Special Agent Robert Kendrick from the FBI's Washington field office, and he asked if James would be willing to come downtown the following morning to discuss a matter of national security. When James asked what this was about, Kendrick's response was careful and deliberate. He said it concerned someone James knew well, someone he saw regularly, someone he trusted. And then Kendrick said a name that made James's stomach drop: David Brenner. James Mitchell and David Brenner had met in the fall of 1964 at Georgetown University, where they were both graduate students in the School of Foreign Service. James was studying international relations with a focus on Soviet affairs, drawn to the field by a fascination with the Cold War that had defined his adolescence. David was pursuing a degree in economics, planning to work in international development. They had been assigned adjacent rooms in graduate housing, and their friendship developed through the organic proximity of late-night conversations in the hallway, shared meals at the dining hall, and the mutual recognition that they were both somewhat out of place among their wealthier, more connected classmates. James came from a working-class family in Pennsylvania, the first in his family to attend college, let alone graduate school. David's background was similarly modest, though the details were always somewhat vague. He mentioned growing up in the Midwest, moving around a lot as a child, because his father worked in manufacturing. He spoke with no discernible regional accent, which James had attributed to that peripatetic childhood, to the way constant relocation smooths out linguistic markers and leaves a person sounding like they could be from anywhere or nowhere. They graduated together in 1966, and while many of their classmates went into government service or joined think tanks, both James and David took positions at the Brookings Institution, a prominent Washington research organization that focused on domestic and foreign policy. James worked as a research associate in the Foreign Policy Program, analyzing Soviet economic policy and writing reports that were occasionally cited in congressional testimony. David worked in the Economic Studies program, focusing on international trade and development assistance. Their offices were on different floors, but they had lunch together 2 or 3 times a week, usually at a deli on Massachusetts Avenue, where the sandwiches were cheap and the coffee was terrible. They played tennis on weekends when the weather allowed, attended the occasional Senators' game, and spent countless evenings at each other's apartments, drinking beer and arguing about policy questions, with the intensity of people who genuinely believed that ideas mattered. In 1971, James got married to a woman named Sarah, whom he had met at a conference on arms control. David was his best man, giving a toast at the wedding reception that was funny and sincere in equal measure, telling stories about James's legendary disorganization and his even more legendary stubbornness, but also speaking with genuine warmth about how James was one of the most principled people he had ever known. Sarah liked David, found him charming if a bit reserved, and she welcomed him into their social circle without reservation. When their daughter Claire was born in 1973, David was among the first people to visit the hospital, bringing flowers and a stuffed animal, and looking genuinely moved as he held the infant with the awkward care of someone unaccustomed to babies. David never married. He dated occasionally, mentioning women he had met at work or through mutual friends, but nothing ever seemed to develop into anything serious. When James asked him about it, usually after they had both had a few drinks, David would shrug and say he was too set in his ways, too focused on his work, too much of a loner to make a relationship work. James accepted this explanation because it seemed plausible enough. Not everyone was built for marriage, and David seemed content with his life, his small circle of friends, his work at Brookings, his modest apartment in DuPont Circle, where the bookshelves were filled with economics texts and the walls were decorated with maps. But now, sitting in a windowless conference room at the FBI's Washington field office at 10:15 on the morning of November 9, 1979, James Mitchell was being told that everything he thought he knew about David Brenner was a lie. Special Agent Robert Kendrick sat across from him, flanked by another agent whose name, James, had already forgotten, and methodically laid out a case that was as comprehensive as it was devastating. David Brenner, Kendrick explained, was not David Brenner. His real name, according to intelligence the FBI had received from a defector who had recently come over from the Soviet side, was Dmitri Volkov. He was an officer of the KGB, trained at the intelligence service's elite academy outside Moscow, and he had been inserted into the United States sometime in the early 1960s with instructions to establish himself in Washington's policy community, build a network of contacts, and report back on American political and economic thinking. Kendrick spoke in the measured tone of someone who had delivered this kind of information before, who understood that the person sitting across from him was processing a fundamental betrayal. He showed James documents, photographs, intercepted communications, all carefully redacted to protect sources and methods, but clear enough in their implications. There were surveillance photos of David meeting with known Soviet intelligence officers, always in public places, always brief encounters that could be explained away as coincidental if anyone had noticed them. There were bank records showing deposits that came through circuitous routes, amounts that supplemented David's Brookings salary in ways that suggested additional income from an undisclosed source. There was a transcript of a phone call made from a payphone in Georgetown to a number at the Soviet embassy, in which someone who sounded like David used phrases that intelligence analysts had identified as coded communication. James sat there, trying to absorb what he was being told, trying to reconcile the man he had known for 15 years with the portrait being painted by these federal agents. He asked how they could be certain, how they knew this wasn't some mistake, some case of mistaken identity or faulty intelligence. Kendrick's response was patient, but firm. The Biobo defector who had provided the information had worked in the KGB's North American division. He had seen Volkov's file, knew his legend, his cover identity, his assignment. The defector had described David Brenner in specific detail, down to the scar on his left forearm from what David had always said was a childhood accident involving a bicycle and a barbed wire fence. The defector had even mentioned Georgetown, had mentioned Brookings, had mentioned James Mitchell by name as one of Volkov's primary contacts, someone who had been cultivated over years, someone whose friendship provided access and legitimacy. That last detail hit James with particular force. The friendship had been cultivated. It had been strategic, purposeful, a means to an end. Every conversation they had ever had about Soviet policy, every debate about arms control or détente, every casual mention of what James was working on or who he was meeting with, all of it had been intelligence collection disguised as friendship. David had not been his friend. David had been his handler, or at least his access agent, mining him for information without James ever suspecting that their relationship was anything other than genuine. Kendrick let that sink in for a moment before continuing. He said that the FBI had been watching David for approximately 3 weeks since the defector had first provided the information. They had not yet made an arrest because they wanted to understand the full scope of his network, to identify everyone he was in contact with, to build a case that would hold up in court. But they also wanted to know if James had any information that might be useful, anything David had said or done over the years that seemed unusual or suspicious in retrospect. Kendrick emphasized that James was not under investigation, that the FBI understood he had been deceived, that he was a victim in this situation. but anything James could tell them might help. James tried to think back through 15 years of friendship, searching for anomalies, for moments that should have raised red flags, but had seemed perfectly normal at the time. He remembered how David always paid in cash, never used credit cards, always claimed to prefer the simplicity of physical currency. He remembered how David had discouraged him from visiting his apartment without calling first, always framing it as a matter of respecting boundaries, of maintaining some separation between their professional and personal lives. He remembered that David had never introduced him to his family, had always said they were estranged, that his parents had passed away when he was young and he had no siblings. He remembered how David seemed to know things before they became public knowledge, how he would occasionally mention a development in Soviet economic policy or a shift in Kremlin leadership weeks before it appeared in the newspapers, always attributing his information to academic journals or contacts in the intelligence community that he never quite specified. All of these details, which had seemed either unremarkable or mildly eccentric at the time, now appeared in a different light. They were elements of tradecraft, operational security measures, the careful compartmentalization of a life lived under false pretenses. And James had missed all of them because he had never thought to look, because the idea that his closest friend might be a Soviet spy had never entered his mind as anything other than an absurd hypothetical. Kendrick asked James if he would be willing to help, not in any official capacity, not as an informant or an undercover operative, but simply by maintaining his normal routine, by continuing to see David as he always had, while being alert to anything that might provide the FBI with useful intelligence. James asked what would happen if he refused, if he simply walked away and pretended this conversation had never happened. Kendrick's response was honest. He said that James could do that he was under no legal obligation to cooperate. But he also said that David Brenner, or Dmitri Volkov, or whatever his real name was, would eventually be arrested and charged with espionage. And when that happened, James's friendship with him would be scrutinized by the media, by Congress, by anyone with an interest in the case. James's career, his reputation, his security clearance, all of it would be called into question, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he had been close to a Soviet agent for 15 years without detecting anything amiss. James understood what was being offered. Cooperation would insulate him from suspicion, would demonstrate that he was a loyal American who had been deceived rather than complicit. It would also give him a chance to understand what had really been happening, to see David's mask slip, to find some kind of closure or at least clarity about a relationship that had just been revealed to be fundamentally fraudulent. And so, James agreed. He said he would continue seeing David, would maintain their regular lunches and weekend tennis games, would act as though nothing had changed. But inside, everything had changed. Over the following 2 weeks, James saw David 3 times. The first encounter was lunch on November 12th at their usual deli. James had spent the morning rehearsing how to act naturally, reminding himself not to stare, not to ask leading questions, not to do anything that might signal his awareness of David's true identity. When he walked into the deli and saw David sitting in their usual booth, reading the Washington Post and drinking coffee, James felt a surge of anger so intense it made his hands shake. This man had lied to him for 15 years. This man had used their friendship as cover for espionage. This man had sat in James's living room, had held his infant daughter, had toasted his marriage, all while living a complete fabrication. But James forced himself to smile, to slide into the booth across from David, to order his usual sandwich and make small talk about work and the weather, and an article David had been reading about inflation trends. David seemed entirely normal, perhaps even more relaxed than usual, laughing at a joke James made about their incompetent supervisor at Brookings, asking after Sarah and Claire, mentioning that he was thinking about taking a trip to New York over Thanksgiving to visit a college friend James had never heard him mention before. They talked for nearly an hour, and to anyone watching, it would have appeared to be exactly what it was supposed to be: two friends having lunch. But James was listening differently now, noting the vagueness of David's stories, the way he deflected personal questions, the careful construction of a persona that revealed nothing while seeming to reveal everything. The second encounter was tennis on November 17th. They played at an indoor court in Arlington, their usual Saturday morning routine. David won, 2-1, as he usually did, and afterward they sat in the parking lot drinking water and talking about a recent article in Foreign Affairs about Soviet military doctrine. James found himself wondering whether this conversation, like so many they had had over the years, was being filed away in David's memory to be written up in a report and transmitted to Moscow. He wondered how many insights he had inadvertently provided, how many pieces of analysis he had shared that had made their way into KGB assessments of American policy. The thought made him sick. The third encounter was drinks on November 20th. David called James at work and suggested they meet at a bar near DuPont Circle, which was unusual because David almost never initiated social plans. James agreed, and that evening he found David already there, sitting at a corner table with a bourbon in front of him, looking uncharacteristically pensive. They talked for a while about nothing in particular, but then David said something that made James's pulse quicken. He said he had been thinking about leaving Washington, about taking a position at a university in California, or maybe even going overseas for a while, working for an international organization. It was time for a change, David said. He had been doing the same thing for too long, living in the same city, working at the same institution. He needed something different. James asked if this was serious, or just one of those late-night what-if conversations they sometimes had after a few drinks. David's response was measured. He said it was something he was considering, that he had not made any decisions yet, but that he wanted James to know he might be leaving sooner rather than later. And then David said something that James would replay in his mind countless times over the years that followed. He said that James had been a good friend, one of the best he had ever had, and that whatever happened, James should know that their friendship had meant something to David, that it had not all been a performance. James wanted to scream at him. He wanted to grab David by the collar and demand the truth, demand to know who he really was, demand to know if any of their 15 years together had been genuine, or if it had all been a calculated deception. But he forced himself to stay calm, to nod, to say that David was a good friend too, and that he would be sorry to see him leave, but understood the need for change. And then they finished their drinks and went their separate ways, and James drove home feeling like he was losing his mind. He called Agent Kendrick from a payphone the next morning and reported the conversation. Kendrick listened carefully and then said that the FBI believed David might be preparing to flee the country, that the talk about California and overseas positions might be cover for an extraction plan. The Bureau had decided to move up the timeline for arrest. They would take David into custody within the next 48 hours, and they wanted James to be prepared for the fact that his name would likely come up during the investigation. Kendrick also said that after the arrest, someone from the Bureau would contact James to conduct a more thorough debriefing, to go through his entire history with David and identify anything that might be relevant to the case. David Brenner was arrested on the morning of November 23, 1979, as he left his apartment building in DuPont Circle. According to the arrest report that James would read months later, David did not resist. He did not ask for a lawyer. He simply looked at the agents surrounding him and said, "I was wondering when you would come." He was taken to the FBI field office and placed in an interrogation room, and over the following days, he provided what investigators described as a limited but substantive confession. He confirmed that his real name was Dmitri Volkov, that he had been born in Moscow in 1938, and that he had been recruited by the KGB while attending university, showing promise in languages and psychological assessment. He had been trained extensively in the early 1960s, given his legend as David Brenner, and inserted into the United States in 1963 with instructions to pursue graduate education and establish himself in Washington's foreign policy community. His assignment, he explained, had been intelligence collection, but of a particular kind. He was not stealing classified documents or recruiting spies. He was building relationships with people who had access to information, people who worked in think tanks and universities and government agencies, people who talked freely about their work because they trusted him and saw no reason not to. He would have conversations, ask questions that seemed natural and innocent, and then write detailed reports about what he had learned. These reports went to the Soviet embassy in Washington, where they were analyzed and forwarded to Moscow, where they informed Soviet assessments of American policy and thinking. When asked specifically about James Mitchell, David, or Dmitri, was surprisingly forthcoming. He said that James had been one of his most valuable contacts, not because James had access to classified information, he did not, but because James was smart and insightful and deeply knowledgeable about Soviet affairs. Conversations with James had given Dmitri a window into how American analysts thought about the Soviet Union, what assumptions they were making, what data they were relying on, what blind spots they had. This information, Dmitri said, was extremely useful to Moscow because it allowed Soviet policymakers to understand how they were being perceived and to anticipate American responses to Soviet actions. But Dmitri also said something else, something that the FBI agents conducting the interrogation found difficult to categorize. He said that his friendship with James Mitchell had become more complicated over the years, that what had started as a purely operational relationship had evolved into something that felt genuine, at least on his side. He had not expected to like James as much as he did. He had not expected to feel conflicted about the deception, and he had not expected that maintaining the lie would become increasingly difficult as the years went on and the friendship deepened. The FBI did not know what to make of this. Soviet intelligence officers were trained to manipulate, to feign emotion, to say whatever was necessary to achieve their objectives. Dmitri's claim that the friendship had been real, or partially real, or real in some complicated sense, could have been just another layer of deception, an attempt to seem human and sympathetic, to create doubt in the minds of his interrogators. Or it could have been true. The line between performance and reality, between operational cover and genuine emotion, was not always clear, even to the person living it. James learned about the confession through Agent Kendrick, who met with him in late December to conduct the promised debriefing. Kendrick relayed what Dmitri had said about James being a valuable contact, about the intelligence that had been gathered through their friendship, but he also relayed the part about the relationship becoming complicated, about Dmitri's apparent ambivalence. Kendrick seemed uncertain about whether this information would make James feel better or worse, and James himself could not decide. On one hand, it was some small consolation to know that the friendship had not been entirely fraudulent, that David or Dmitri had apparently struggled with the deception. On the other hand, it changed nothing. Dmitri had still lied for 15 years. He had still used James. He had still betrayed him in the most fundamental way possible. The case went to trial in the spring of 1980. Dmitri Volkov pleaded guilty to charges of espionage and acting as an agent of a foreign government without notification. The plea deal he negotiated spared him the death penalty, but resulted in a sentence of 30 years in federal prison. The trial was covered extensively in the media, and James's name appeared in several articles, identified as one of Volkov's primary contacts. The articles were careful to note that James had cooperated with the FBI, that he had been cleared of any wrongdoing, that he had been an unwitting victim of a sophisticated intelligence operation. But the stigma remained. Colleagues at Brookings looked at him differently now, with a mixture of sympathy and suspicion. How, they seemed to be asking, could he not have known? How could he have been so close to a Soviet agent for so long without detecting anything? James asked himself the same question. He replayed every conversation, every interaction, every moment of their 15-year friendship, searching for clues he had missed. And he found them, in retrospect. The evasiveness about David's background, the cash-only lifestyle, the lack of family, connections, the uncanny knowledge of Soviet affairs, the careful boundary maintenance. All of it should have raised questions. But it had not, because James had trusted David, had believed that their friendship was built on mutual respect and shared interests, had never imagined that someone could maintain such an elaborate deception for so long. Sarah tried to be supportive, but the strain of the situation affected their marriage. She had liked David, had welcomed him into their home, and now she felt violated by his presence in their lives. She also worried about James's security clearance, about whether the association with a Soviet spy would damage his career. Those concerns proved justified. In June 1980, James's clearance was suspended, pending a review by the Defense Department. The review took 7 months and included multiple interviews, polygraph examinations, and a comprehensive audit of James's financial records and travel history. He was eventually cleared, and his security restored. But the process was humiliating and exhausting, and it reinforced the sense that he was being punished for something he had not done, for a betrayal he had not committed. James left Brookings in 1981 and took a teaching position at American University, which felt like a retreat, but also like a necessary change. He could not continue working in an environment where he was constantly reminded of the deception, where every meeting and conversation carried the shadow of what had happened. Teaching was different. It was more straightforward, less entangled with the intelligence community, less likely to put him in situations where his past association with Dmitri Volkov would be held against him. He never visited Dmitri in prison. He thought about it occasionally, imagined what he might say, what questions he might ask. But he could never bring himself to actually go. What would be the point? What could Dmitri tell him that would make any difference? The friendship had been a lie. That was the central truth, and no amount of conversation or explanation could change it. In 1991, after the Soviet Union collapsed, James received a letter. It had been forwarded through his attorney, having originally been sent to the federal prison where Dmitri was serving his sentence. The letter was brief, handwritten in the precise script James remembered from notes David used to leave when borrowing books. Dmitri wrote that he had followed James's career over the years through newspaper articles and academic publications. He said he was proud of what James had accomplished, of the work he was doing, of the life he had built. He said he understood that James would never forgive him, that he did not expect forgiveness or ask for it. But he wanted James to know that the friendship had been real, at least as real as anything in Dmitri's life had ever been. He said that he had been trained to manipulate, to deceive, to use people as assets. But with James, it had become something more complicated. He had genuinely cared about James, had genuinely valued their conversations, had genuinely regretted the lie, even as he continued to maintain it. The letter ended with a single sentence that James found both infuriating and strangely moving. Dmitri wrote, "You were the best friend I never had." James read the letter 3 times and then placed it in a drawer in his desk, where it remained for years. He never responded. He never wrote back. But he kept the letter, and sometimes, late at night when he could not sleep, he would take it out and read it again, trying to understand what it meant, trying to decide whether Dmitri had been telling the truth or whether this was just one more layer of manipulation, one final attempt to elicit sympathy or forgiveness or some acknowledgement that their relationship had meant something. He never arrived at a satisfactory answer. The truth, he came to realize, was probably that Dmitri himself did not fully understand what he felt, or what had been real, and what had been performance. People who live double lives for extended periods often lose the ability to distinguish between their authentic selves and their cover identities. The mask becomes the face, the performance becomes the reality, and what remains underneath, if anything, is impossible to access or articulate. Dmitri Volkov died in federal prison in 2004 at the age of 66, having served 24 years of his sentence. James learned about it from a former colleague at Brookings, who had seen the obituary in a trade publication that covered intelligence matters. The obituary was brief, noting only that Volkov had been a Soviet intelligence officer convicted of espionage in 1980, and that he had died of complications from heart disease. There was no mention of his life before his arrest, no mention of Georgetown or Brookings or the friendships he had cultivated. He had been reduced to a single dimension, a spy who had been caught, a cautionary tale about the Cold War. James attended no funeral because there was none. Dmitri had no family in the United States, no one to claim his body or arrange for burial. He was cremated at state expense, and his ashes were disposed of according to standard protocols for deceased federal prisoners. He disappeared as completely from death as he had appeared in life, a person without history or connections, defined entirely by the lies he had told and the secrets he had kept. James Mitchell retired from teaching in 2010 at the age of 68. He had spent 3 decades building a career that was respectable, if not particularly distinguished, writing articles and books that were cited occasionally but never became influential, training students who went on to work in government and academia but who rarely stayed in touch. He had lived a good life by most measures, raised a daughter who became a lawyer, maintained a marriage that survived the strain of the Volkov case, avoided the pitfalls of bitterness and paranoia that consumed some of his colleagues who had also been targeted by Soviet intelligence. But he never fully recovered from the betrayal. The knowledge that his closest friendship had been a lie, that 15 years of trust and intimacy had been built on deception, left a mark that never faded. He became more guarded in his relationships, more skeptical of people's motivations, more aware of the gap between what people presented and what they concealed. He never allowed himself to be that close to anyone outside his immediate family again. The cost of trust, he had learned, was simply too high. Sarah passed away in 2018 after a long illness, and James found himself alone in the house they had shared for more than 4 decades. His daughter Claire visited when she could, but she had her own life, her own family, her own obligations. And so James spent his days reading, gardening, occasionally meeting former colleagues for lunch, trying to fill the hours with activities that gave his life some structure and meaning. One afternoon in the spring of 2019, while cleaning out the attic, James came across a box of old photographs from his years at Georgetown. There were pictures of him and David playing tennis, pictures of them at graduation, pictures of them at various social events and conferences. He sat on the dusty floor of the attic and went through them one by one, studying David's face, looking for some indication of deception, some hint of the truth beneath the surface. But there was nothing. David looked happy in these photographs. He looked like a friend. He looked real. James understood intellectually that everything in those photographs was a performance, that the person captured in those images was a fictional character maintained by a Soviet intelligence officer. But he also understood, in a way he had resisted for decades, that the emotions might have been complicated, that Dmitri Volkov might have genuinely struggled with the life he was living, that the friendship might have been both real and false simultaneously, depending on how you defined those terms. It did not make the betrayal hurt less. It did not excuse what Dmitri had done. But it complicated the narrative in ways that felt more true than the simple story of deception and betrayal that James had told himself for 40 years. People were not simple. Espionage was not simple. And the Cold War, for all its clear ideological divisions, had been fought by human beings who carried contradictions and ambiguities that did not fit neatly into categories of loyalty and treason, truth and lies, friend and enemy. James placed the photographs back in the box and carried it downstairs to his study. He set it on his desk next to the letter Dmitri had sent him decades earlier. And he sat there for a long time, looking at these artifacts of a friendship that had been both completely real and completely false, trying to make peace with the fact that he would never fully understand what had happened, what any of it had meant, or whether the man he had known as David Brenner had ever actually existed at all. The story of James Mitchell and Dmitri Volkov is not unique in the history of Cold War espionage. There are dozens of similar cases, friendships that were revealed to be intelligence operations, relationships that turned out to be cover for deception. What makes this particular story significant is not its uniqueness, but its ordinariness. The way it illustrates how espionage functioned at the human level, how it exploited the fundamental human need for connection and trust, how it turned the most intimate relationships into weapons. James Mitchell lived with the consequences of that weaponization for the rest of his life. He never fully trusted anyone again. He never allowed himself to be vulnerable in the way he had been with David. And he spent decades wondering whether he had been a fool for missing the signs, or whether the signs had simply been too well hidden, whether his friendship had been cultivated or genuine, whether Dmitri had been a skilled manipulator or a conflicted human being trying to survive in an impossible situation. The answer, almost certainly, was some combination of all of those things. But that answer provided no comfort, no resolution, no sense of closure. It simply reflected the messy, complicated reality of human relationships in the context of geopolitical conflict, where loyalty and betrayal were not always clearly distinguishable, where the performance of friendship could become indistinguishable from friendship itself, and where the casualties were measured not in deaths, but in shattered trust and broken bonds that could never be repaired. James Mitchell died in his sleep on a cold morning in January 2023 at the age of 81. His obituary in the Washington Post made no mention of Dmitri Volkov. It described him as a respected scholar, a devoted father, a man who had contributed to the understanding of Soviet affairs during a critical period in American history. It was an accurate summary of his public life, but it left out the part that had defined him most fundamentally, the friendship that had been revealed to be a lie, the betrayal that had shaped everything that came after. Among his possessions, Claire found the box of photographs and the letter from Dmitri. She read the letter carefully, studied the photographs, and tried to understand what her father had experienced. She had been too young to remember David, had only vague impressions of a man who came to their house sometimes when she was very small. But she understood from the way her father had kept these items, had preserved them for more than 40 years, that the relationship had meant something profound, that the loss had cut deeper than any simple categorization of betrayal could capture. She placed the photographs and the letter in an archive at Georgetown University, where they joined other documents related to Cold War intelligence operations. They sit there now, available to researchers, part of the historical record. Two men who had been friends, one of whom had been lying the entire time, or most of the time, or some of the time. The exact proportions impossible to determine, the truth forever obscured by the nature of deception itself. And that, in the end, is what makes the story so haunting. Not the fact of the betrayal, which was clear and documented and undeniable. But the question of what lay beneath it, whether anything real had existed underneath the lies, whether Dmitri Volkov had ever felt genuine affection for James Mitchell, or whether every moment of their friendship had been calculated and false. The question that James spent his life trying to answer, and that remained, even after both men were gone, fundamentally unanswerable.